Welcome to Conversations The Journey. I'm your host, Ellis Rice, and today we have with us a very special guest, Omiyale Jube, which some of us still know her as Annika Johnson, an author, Navigate Your Existence, and a metaphysician. So let's please welcome Omiyale Jube.
Greetings.
Greetings. So welcome to Conversations. Appreciate you being here. I've had the good fortune of knowing you for several years.
Yeah.
And now even I first met you as the mother of Kwanzaa, and then later as your son was one of my theater students.
Both of them.
So
Yes.
so we've had some time.
Yeah, a long time ago.
And I've learned a lot just watching you and having you
Great.
teach us and care for us and welcome the community into your life. So on Conversations, we consider this an exploration of the epic and the ordinary. The ordinary is being your life that you've lived every day, but to some of us looking in at it, just looking at your introduction, that title, it's pretty epic. You've done some things.
Yeah,
So
some things.
we'd like to start off with what we call your origin story. Yes, you paint us this picture of what it was like to be the young person in your life and the neighborhood, the community, the people who were there for you. Please.
Well, I'm originally from New York City, Harlem, USA, born and bred. And early on in my life, I was involved in the cultural revolution of Harlem. It was a time when blacks were trying to find out who we were. It was the time of the cultural revolution, the civil rights era, and we were trying to find out where we fit in. Tired of being known as black and lazy and ugly and good for nothing. Tired of the oppression and what I call the genocide of a people. And I was involved in all of that, from the riots in the street to the beginnings of learning my culture. There were, when I say genocide of a people, I saw it up close and personal. The genocide of my family, whether it was poverty, stress, drugs, the unjust justice system, and watching my family get caught up in all of that.
So right there, you mentioned the family. What kind of neighborhood did you grow up in?
Harlem, USA.
For those of us who didn't grow up in Harlem.
You know, at that time, people think of Harlem as the ghetto, and it was the ghetto. On the other hand, it was the cultural renaissance.
Okay.
So we had the best of everything and the worst of everything.
Okay.
When I grew up in Harlem, I never got mugged.
Okay.
I never got mugged. I grew up on 125th Street, down the street from the Apollo.
Okay.
I grew up around the corner from Columbia University, up the street from City College. We went ice skating at Rockefeller Center.
There you go.
So, I mean, there was a cultural, just not only New York, but living in Harlem in that cultural renaissance.
This is kind of fascinating. You toured with The Last Poet. You know, some of us
Yes.
only know them as this legendary
Yes.
group. And as you mentioned, like these youngsters now call rap. Back in them days, if you didn't know them brothers, I think
Last Poets, absolutely.
Gil Scott Heron came along
my
at that
goodness,
same period
yes,
of time.
yes.
The Watts Prophets, you know,
Yeah.
that's when poetry was deep.
Yes,
And it just wasn't about rhyming, but the rhymes moved us forward as a people.
yes.
So you said they had a touring group in the New York area.
It was G. Falcon Biza. It was his group.
Okay.
And the Last Poets traveled with the troupe. But it was G. Falcon Biza, and he was my mentor. And again, between my sister, Anissa Biza, and G. Falcon Biza, they gave me my cultural beginnings. For those of you that don't know, when I came here and I was doing the Kwanzaa Celebrations at Doolittle, everything I did on that stage, I learned from those three. I just copied. I really did. I just copied everything. They taught me all of it. My participation, I was in the African fashion shows. And they did African fashion shows from the beginning of fabric and clothing all the way to present day or European. So that was my participation in the troupe.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So
you at 11th grade, you determined that teaching your fellow students was vital,
yes,
and then that started your road to being an educator.
yes.
And so, how much more time did you spend in New York, or when did you transition from that environment?
I left New York around, I guess, age 18. I went to college. It was in New York, but it was out of the city. I went to Stony Brook, and so I was about an hour and a half outside of the city, which actually gave me, there was a time when, around that era, we went from the Cultural Revolution, talking about my brother, my sister, to Superfly. Yeah. So we went from my Nubian king and queen to the pimp and the hoe, almost overnight. But that just shows you the power of media, because that one movie, Superfly, changed everything. And next thing you know, again, with the flooding of the drugs, everything changed. And I missed that era because I was outside of the city.
Okay.
So, and shortly after that, I moved to Vegas with husband number one,
Okay.
Leonard Johnson, yes. And so he had one more year to do in the military. And so he wound up out here at Nellis.
Okay.
And after I graduated, I joined him. So he had just come from overseas. I used to tour with him, I used to go overseas. He was stationed in Amsterdam. And so I used to go overseas. And once he had his last year, he's stationed at Nellis, and we wound up in Vegas. That's how I got to Vegas.
So you met him in college, or you knew him in
I knew him from Harlem.
Okay.
Yeah, I grew up on 125th Street in the projects, and he grew up on Amsterdam Avenue, not far away.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one would call it a childhood sweetheart.
Yes, he was.
Look at that.
Yes, he was.
Nice.
Yeah.
So you moved to Vegas, and what was Vegas like in those years?
Oh my goodness, I moved to Vegas in the early 70s, and it was a shock. Moving from New York to Vegas, it was really a shock. It was a cultural shock. And that's where I found my cultural teachings, I would say. Because in New York, I wasn't teaching, I was learning. I was traveling. But when I came here, I saw the need for a cultural revolution. And I began teaching Black history, whether it was in the schools. I brought Kwanzaa. I started having the Kwanzaa celebrations at my home, early 70s. And that continued for years. And people just still weren't understanding what it was. So I took it to the community. That's when I began the cultural Kwanzaa celebrations at Doolittle.
Now, just for those who don't know,
Yes,
Kwanzaa, created by Dr. Malana Karanga,
yes,
1966.
yes,
We hadn't always had that holiday, and you were one of the. And you said you were teaching it in the 70s.
yes.
So you were one of the outliers.
And I have to give credit to my sister. My sister started celebrating right after the inception of Kwanzaa, like the second year.
Wow.
And so, again, everything I learned from her. And so when I came here, I just duplicated. I duplicated. So as I went to Doolittle, because the community wasn't getting it. I was on the radio, television, and it seemed like people were still calling it the Black Christmas. So I felt the need to take it to the community. Kwanzaa should be a celebration in the home, primarily in the home. Yes, you can have your community celebrations, but it's that home flavor, that feeling, that inbringing, that ingathering of the community into the home. So I took it to Doolittle, and it was awesome. We had all-day celebrations, an all-day celebration. The community came in and did different presentations. I had an AXO group, Afro-Academic, Cultural, Technological, and Scientific Olympic.
Okay.
It was an offshoot of the NAACP, and it was a cultural, scientific Olympic competition. And so I had the youth from all of the high schools.
Just how you've helped to culturally enrich this Las Vegas community. And so who were some of the other people? Were you solo on this? Were there other people who...
You know, when I started with Kwanzaa, when we went to Doolittle, there was a small group, a very small group. And I don't remember everyone, but Baba Kimya was there.
Okay.
Titi Lyle was there.
Wow.
Let me see. I can't remember everyone. I know one of the final, because I only did 4 years. My friend Nombeko Hicks, she was my ace boon coon. She was at my side. I want to say Gwen Walker was in the small group. And I can't remember everyone.
Oh, yeah.
Ramon Savoy was working with me with Axel. And so he was around. Yeah. David Washington, I remember one of the final celebrations we did at Doolittle. David Washington and the firefighters, they brought in all the fruit. So it's a small group.
Nice.
And then from there, the West Las Vegas Arts Center took up the helm. Because at that time, there was no West Las Vegas Arts Center.
Right.
But they took up the helm, and to this day, they have carried on the culture for Las Vegas. Yes, yes, yes.
That's with Dr. Marsha Robinson over
Absolutely. And the twins, Jewel and Yanni. And you, of course.
Yeah.
You were there. So yes, yes, yes. China.
Yeah, I remember we had a grant, a humanities grant, where we celebrated language and literature through the Black experience was what it was called. We brought in
Yes.
John Amos to do his Hades Comet piece. We opened with the film Sankofa.
Yes.
And it was a 12-month program. And then Kwanzaa became a part of that, to teach people how to celebrate it in their homes, but
Yes.
you come to the communities, and it's never really transitioned back. I think you're one of the primary people who still promote celebrating it in your homes.
In the home.
In your homes, and
In
not
the
just that
home.
week, but all year round. You know, all year round we should be celebrating those principles. You don't just,
principles, absolutely.
So the Nguzo Saba. So
Yes, yes, yes.
it's a lot. In fact, on our website, bluesoulproductions.com, we have a presentation of you doing a Kwanzaa ceremony.
I saw that today.
And we've been very fortunate to have that as what we can offer to the community on our community page. And it's been good. It's been good for us. Like I say, you taught me Kwanzaa. I'm from a small Black community in Kinloch, Missouri, but we didn't celebrate Kwanzaa where I'm from. And even in my St. Louis and LA days, we didn't celebrate.
Right.
I didn't, per se. Until
Well, even when I came out here, it was still new. It was still very, very new. So yeah.
It's been a good journey. And particularly when I find purpose is probably the main one I spout off at these youngsters. It's like, you're working a job, and you're angry about going to work because you don't have a purpose. You don't have your work to do. So if we can start to get people to focus on that, you might have a little less tension in your life, because you're actually investing your time in something that becomes your work and what you're contributing to the world. And that's always good to see.
Absolutely.
So you became a principal, and you
Yes.
went through that experience, but educated for so many years, and then a principal. What made you go from becoming a teacher? Was it just a natural progression, or did you see a greater work?
Okay, I was a teacher for many years. I was very, very fortunate because, of course, I wasn't like the normal teacher.
Okay.
And I was fortunate. My principals let me do whatever I wanted to do. I didn't have to follow the curriculum. So instead of an alternative school, it was an alternative classroom, because what you're going to learn in my class was going to be what I was supposed to teach, and then some other stuff. And at a certain point, I found that I was watching how they were dumbing down America. Every year, the textbooks, the vocabulary level decreased, the font got bigger, and we were being drawn back into, and there was a certain time where education was coming out of the restrictions and we were freer to teach. And I believe it was first Daddy Bush that came up with Back to the Basics.
Okay.
And what that was an attempt to control what everyone was teaching, what everyone was learning. Then after that, it was Baby Bush who came up with No Child Left Behind,
Okay.
which was just ridiculous. Okay, so we had gotten to the point where we were getting out of, you have to read in this book, or you have to have this textbook or this math book. And teachers were finding ways to really teaching the concepts instead of rote, teaching, having students be able to read their own book, just like adults do. And adults, when you find a book that you want to read, if you don't like it, you put it down. If you get one you really like, you'll read the whole book. So instead of having them read out of a reading book where they had excerpts of different books, and you had the round robin where you sit in a circle, and when it's your turn to read, you're not paying attention, and they say, hey, it's your turn. You know, and you read a paragraph, and then you go back to watching the flies.
Wow.
We were giving books. We were letting the students have their own book to read, and then you can teach what you needed from that book. Education was separate. The European system of education, everything's separate. Spelling, and then you have your language, and you have your vocabulary and your writing. Instead of melanin dominant people, learn globally. Don't separate it, give me the whole thing. And we were getting back to that. And then Baby Bush came up with No Child Left Behind. And I could not teach with those restrictions. And I went on to become a principal. Yeah. Matter of fact, it wasn't until Daddy Bush, Baby Bush, came up with No Child Left Behind that I could no longer be a principal.
Really?
Because then I was at Joe Mackey, which was a magnet school. They gave me free license. I had creative license. And then all of a sudden, when No Child Left Behind came out, they started pulling back all my creative license, telling me what I could teach, what I couldn't teach. And so I couldn't have that. So I had to go. Yeah.
So you went from there, and then you started to teach in another form through your writing.
Well,
Or did that come much later?
my journey from teaching culture, Black history, African history, culture, Kwanzaa, that was my purpose, that was my passion. And over the years, my passion shifted to teaching metaphysics.
Okay.
And when I say metaphysics, when we were coming up in the church, they told us metaphysics was of the devil. You couldn't talk about it. Spooky stuff. If you look at the word metaphysics, it simply means meta, beyond the physical, beyond this physical body of 5 senses. Telling us that if you can't see it, touch it, feel it, it's not there. Which we understand beyond the physical, there's a lot that we can't see. Gravity, but it's there.
Mm-hmm.
So as I began to get more into the metaphysical understandings, I went from teaching Black history to teaching metaphysics. I felt like, just like in my journey, my early journey, where I felt that if Blacks knew who they were, and they had that self-esteem, that their lives would be better, that they would make better choices, and be able to fight the oppression better. I feel the same about metaphysics. Understanding the ancients had the secrets. If we go back and we start teaching, learning about our African heritage, and we go back, but we don't go back far enough. If you go back far enough, that's where you're going to find metaphysics. Matter of fact, it's not really called metaphysics, it's called spirituality.
Okay.
It's spirituality, it's God's source. When you think of the European concept of science, where you have to know it, you have to prove it, you have to see it. Then you take that to the next level of metaphysics, understanding that which you can't see is still there. Take it a step further. Metaphysics is a Greek word.
Okay.
Take it back to the ancients. It's simply spirituality, spirit, God's source. And because we have been told not to touch it, there is a lack of understanding of what that is. People are still afraid. When you say metaphysics, they don't numerology, astrology, they're afraid. When the whole Bible is based on astrology and numerology.
Okay.
Okay? So we're coming into a time that we have to change, shift our mentality. I don't remember where I began to learn about the cycles of time. Astrology, it's not just about your sun sign, so much more. It's about the celestial bodies and how they've shifted, and the shifting of that energy is bringing us into a different time period. Cycles of time, 26,000 year cycles, 5,000 year cycles of time, 2,000 year cycles of time. In the coming of 2012, all of that shifted into new cycles. And so this last cycle, this last 2,000 year cycle of the age of Pisces was not a good cycle for Earth. It was a cycle of death, deceit, destruction, disease. It was a cycle of control, religious control, educational control, monetary systems, and greed. And now that we're shifting into the age of Aquarius, all of those systems have to go. We're shifting into a new time. And with that, we've got to change too. We've got to shift. And so my passion right now is to bring that knowledge forth. My first book, Navigate Your Existence, 7 Keys to the African American Resurrection, was just that. It was an introduction specifically for African American people to metaphysics, because so many people were afraid. When I wrote that book in 2014, people weren't talking about the chakra system. They didn't even know what it was. You talk to people, they weren't talking, not black folks, you know. Now, what is it, 8 years later? They're talking about metaphysics. They're talking about numerology now. They're beginning to talk about astrology and the cycles of time. So we're coming into it. But my passion right now is to bring forth the knowledge of metaphysics. There's so much that we have to learn and understand and look at with a different perspective.
Are you finding it being received well?
No. No. You know, when I was teaching Black history, oh my God, it was received well. People listened. They understood what I was saying. I find that, and that's why I wrote the book. I find that prior to me writing the book, I started in, I think, 2006, took me a long time, but I started in 2006, and I was doing presentations. It was hard to, as they say, put butts in the seats, because people didn't really understand what they were coming to hear.
Okay.
And so that's why I wrote the book. I put it in a book. The book has been received extremely well.
Okay.
For that, I'm grateful. I'm grateful. But in general, we as a people, we are really coming into the understanding of metaphysics much more readily than before.
Maybe here on Blue Soul Productions, we may be able to create a platform so you to have a way of discussing this.
Absolutely.
With a little bit more frequency. I would
My
welcome
joy.
That. I would welcome that.
My joy. Absolutely.
When we talk about how things are being received, I had the good fortune of working on my first documentary film, which you did the
Libation.
The Libation.
Yes,
for,
yes, yes.
And my producer, Gail Ferguson,
Yes.
she wrote and directed the film. But as we've put it into the world, this hasn't completely been released yet. We're having a release on June 18th here in Las Vegas. But as you send it to some of the people who look at these things, I'm finding that the concepts of it, spirituality, our comedic history, our proper diet and care for ourselves.
Yes, yes.
And then also we have this one sister, Dr. Dunstan, the first black geneticist out of the University of Michigan, who sat on the first genome project. Brilliant. She is the embodiment of what you're saying about metaphysics and what the genome really exists for us. It's our superpower. She talks about it almost like an evangelist. But I mention that because as we've put it into the world, we found that people are having trouble navigating how to view it. Because it's not the same old, same old. It is a deep dive into how our spiritual selves and our physical selves manifested through our spiritual selves can bring us to a higher level of consciousness and existence.
Absolutely, yes.
And so I'm looking much forward to hearing you be able to share more about that aspect of how we need to exist, because that's really what this show is about. Conversations about us sharing information to help us. And it's been a long time getting here, and this is great.
I love it. Like I said, this is my new passion, my new purpose in life.
And so we're going to backtrack a little bit. You had mentioned some of your, on that show here, we always go back and we give an honor to the mentors, the people who helped shape your thoughts, your mind. And then at the end of that, we ask you to then share what you would. And we call it mother wit. You know, the wit that we get, because that's how we got it. You know, what did mama say?
Oh, yeah.
And those of us who grew up like that know, like, you know, that's the real wisdom. So you had mentioned a couple of your mentors. Would you like to share some information and what some of them, how they shaped you with what their information was?
Well, of course, I spoke about my mother, who gave me my start in metaphysics, actually. My sister, Anissa and Jube, who gave me my cultural start. But I would say I have so many mentors. I would say every author of every book I learned something from. Then I have studied with the masters, whether reading their books or finding videos or actually traveling with them. Asa Hilliard, John Henry Clark. I traveled to Kemet with Dr. Ben in 1990. Oh my goodness, let's see. Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. Oh my goodness. Dr. Welsing, you know, I was always interested in this schism with the races. What is it with the black-white thing? So I was always interested, not only studying black history, but I wanted to know about Europeans, those that came out of the Caucasus Mountains. You know, why do they hate us?
Wow.
And Frances Cress broke it down.
Okay.
She really did. We actually brought her out here in the 80s. And her book, Keys to the Colors, she taught me that those that came out of the Caucasus Mountains, when they came out of those mountains, everywhere they went, they saw the indigenous people, people of color. And when they made it with those people, their children didn't look like them. And that's when they created this schism in their psyche, that they had to have control. And it went from thinking of procreation as a positive thing to a negative. It went from love to lust. It went from intercourse to sex, and that whole perversion of sexuality, and understanding where that came from and why they're coming from a survival instinct of control. There was Juwanza Kunjufu, again in the 80s. He did a presentation, the sun people and the ice people, the we people and the I people. And I have used that presentation to teach for years, always giving him credit. What he taught me was, coming out of the Caucasus Mountains, you had that scarcity. So you had an aggression and you had to fight and claw out your existence. Whereas the Sun people, the we people, we had all the necessities of life. So we could lay back by the coconut tree without the aggression. You know, so that again began to teach me the differences and why there's a clash. And that need for them to control as they spread around the world with that mentality. So that was a big lesson for me. I can go on. There's so many. Ancient Future, I think of the books I've read. Wayne Chandler, Ancient Future. Dr. Africa, and I can't remember the name of his book right now, but Dr. Africa, he talks about eating correctly. I don't remember who taught me about the cycles of time. Drunvalo, The Flower of Life. In terms of metaphysics, the two mentors that I know of that were talking about metaphysics long ago, when many of our icons were still talking about the history, because we were still trying to find out who we were. Dr. Delbert Blair and Phil Valentine. Dr. Blair talked about ETs. When people weren't, you couldn't talk about ETs. He himself was a contactee. He talks about ETs and explained, all right, extraterrestrial, what does it mean? It means extra, you're not on the planet Terra. Terrestrial means the planet was called Terra. And so extra means you were not from here. But he also talks about ITs, talking about the inner terrestrials, that there are entities in the earth right now, been there for a while. He talks about the beings that are walking on the planet that are not from here. And so these are topics that he's been talking about for years and people still don't want to talk about and deal with. So yes, Delbert Blair, Phil Valentine, again, metaphysician long time ago. And everyone was still talking about the culture. He had shifted over to metaphysics. He taught me about sacred geometry and how form comes from down the dimensions into matter. There's just so much to learn. As we move into this age of Aquarius, we've got to leave the old behind, the old belief systems, and open up our minds and move into this new cycle that we're in. Let's see, there are just so many. There's Jule Pukram. I was following Jule Pukram in the 80s. Another one talking about melanin. Jule Pukram, I was following her in the 80s, but I met her recently in the last, I guess, 6-7 years, I don't know. She introduced me to the law of time. Okay, I believe it was 1991, I went to a melanin conference in Oakland. And at the time, the Europeans were having melanin conferences every year, and they were not inviting any black scientists, okay? So a group started having melanin conferences. They had a think tank, a melanin think tank. And I think I made it to the last one, well, the last one I knew of. It was in 1991 in Oakland with Malachi Andrews, and just blew my mind. At the time, we were still talking about pigment. We didn't know anything about melanin. And then from there, I found Dr. T. Owens Moore. And oh my God, I read all his books on melanin. And he taught me so much about melanin, what it really, really is, the phenomenon of melanin. We're coming into the knowledge now slowly, but I've been studying melanin since 1990 and I'm still learning. I met Jule Pukram. I was following her in the 90s, in the 80s, and she was also talking about melanin and so many things. And I actually got to meet her about 6-7 years ago. And at that time, she introduced me to the law of time. The law of time is the Olmec Mayan ancient culture that is coming forth today. When we think of all of the ancients, all of the indigenous people all over the world, when they knew the invaders were coming, they buried the information. Just for this time right now, just for the age of Aquarius, the age of enlightenment. And now all of this information is surfacing again. So Jule Pulkrum introduced me to the law of time, and through her I met Stephanie South, the Red Queen, and European. She studied with two Brazilians, Jose Arguelles and his wife. She studied with them for 9 years, and they have since transitioned. And she is bringing this history forward. Amazing. The book of the Cube, and so many more. She's written so many. But the lawoftime.org is teaching us that everything we're doing, our time is off. Just like our music is off, just like those in control changed our music tune from 432, which is in tune with the harmony and balance of the universe and our bodies, to 440, that is unnatural. Those in control have changed the calendars. We're out of sync with time. So the law of time is teaching us to get back in sync with the beat of the universe, with the beat of our bodies. So yes, I have many, many, many mentors. I know I've left out many, but I've been fortunate. And along with me being a voracious reader, researcher, that is how I've come to this information, and I feel it is my duty. I feel the onus is upon me to share it. And so that's why I share.
Well, that brings us to the second part of the motherwit then. Specifically, you have a young person looking up at you saying, you know, Sister Omiyale, what do I need in life to consider to be successful, or to be, what would you pass on?
That first lesson I learned from my mother, to ask why. Ask the questions. Everybody out there has questions, I know. They have questions that they want that answer to. Ask the questions and then search for the answer. My mother used to tell me, if you ask a question and you don't get an answer that makes sense, that satisfies you, keep that question in your mind and then search until you find that answer. That's what research means. Research, search and search and search again. Step out of your comfort zone. We are in a different time. We are out of the age of Pisces. We are in the age of Aquarius, which means the things we used to do have to change. We can't be afraid of change. What's the song? What's his name? George Benson, Everything Must Change. Nothing stays the same.
Quincy Jones.
What's it? Okay.
Yeah.
I think I heard a different version, but okay.
Oh, yeah.
But you know, again, it's so important to understand people are afraid of change. You can't be afraid of change. Our belief systems, many of them have been passed down for generations through the old age of Pisces, and they don't serve us anymore. When you have someone tells you something and it just doesn't make sense, be in control of your life. Navigate your existence. You are the captain of this ship. Begin to seek. We're in the age of Aquarius. It's in a time where this earth is rising. I know it looks like we're in a horrible time and everything, you've got COVID and oh my goodness, all kind of controls. On the other hand, the spiritual war that we've always heard about, it is raging. Principalities in high places, it is raging. Yes, that war is being fought in the heavens and here on earth. And those that are in control, it's like their last hurrah. Their time is up and they know it. And they're throwing everything at us that they can. But what we must do, we must rise. And so how do you do that? Change your diet. We must eat differently. We can't eat the heavy foods we used to eat. change your diets, fruits and vegetables. Water, increase your water intake. Our body is 70% water. Our brain is 80% water. We don't drink enough. We've got to move our bodies. We've got to exercise so that our circulation, the oxygen can circulate through our bodies. And we have to meditate. We have to still our minds and bodies so that we can connect to the inner core, to God's source that is within. So yes, I say it's time for change. It is time for us to rise with Mother Earth.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Cool. Well, that's pretty much it for me. I know we had one other little question on our survey form, and it mentioned like if you had all of the resources and influence in the world, what would be the one thing? And I love what you wrote, but if you could share that with us.
Well, my mission would be twofold. My first mission would be justice reform. We think about the unjust justice system and the prison complex, industrial complex, because that's what it is, where they took us from the plantation as slaves, and now they move us to the farms, and that's what they call the prisons, the farms, where you were working for free, and now you work for what, 10 cents an hour? So it is a system of slavery. They changed the laws so that we get caught up in the system. So yes, justice reform, be it changing legislation, re-entry programs, so that they can come out. Some prisoners are ready to come out. They've lost contact with their families, and so they have nowhere to go. They don't have an address. Right. They need an address. They need jobs and education. So when you talk about justice reform, it's a massive undertaking. It's not just coming out of prison. It's the whole system has to change. Those that are nonviolent, we want those out. But the ones that are still in there, whatever happened to a rehabilitation? Okay? My second focus would be, again, my current passion and mission is to teach metaphysics. I have to say this. Again, my first love, teaching Black history. And there are people now that say, there's a term, B1, are you Black first? Okay? Anyone who knows me, I've always been Black first. On the other hand, people, when I was teaching Black history, they would call me racist. I was never racist, never. Not that we could be, that's another story. But I always appreciated people. I was interested in raising our people because we were being targeted. But I was never anti-anybody.
Exactly.
When you come into an understanding of metaphysics and universal law, we come into the understanding that we are all connected. We are all connected. There's only one universal mind. And so in this earthly realm, we come to think of ourselves as separate in this physical realm. When you understand metaphysics, you understand that just like the ice cube looks separate until it melts into water and then into gas, we are ultimately all connected. On this planet, as humans, the spiritual fight is against humans. The spiritual fight is against humans. So, yeah, I'm B1, but I'm also for humanity. And once humanity can learn metaphysics, understand universal law, and begin to live by these laws, then the whole planet will be better. The whole planet will be better. Each individual group, if you want to call them races, okay, but each group has a karma that they came here with. So there are lessons that black people have to learn. There's lessons that white folks have to learn. And until we learn our lessons and learn these karmic lessons and understand that we're still united on this earth and in the cosmos when we leave this planet. So there are things that we have to learn about metaphysics, and as we begin to rise consciously, as we begin to understand universal law and think about things differently, and our consciousness rises, we will be more empowered as a collective on this earth, and it'll be a better day. Yes.
I think that's about it. Wow. Well, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
This conversation, Omiyale Jube.
Thank you. Ellis Rice.
Once again, I'm your host, Ellis Rice, and we'll be back the next time. Peace.